You are listening to the Jack Rants Podcast. Here is your host, Jack Rants.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Jack Rants Podcast with me, your host, Jack Knives. Here we discuss whatever and to whoever we feel like talking. Today I wanted to have a discussion about the toxicity of comic book fans. Today I wanted to have a discussion about the toxicity of comic book fandoms, and overall the current state of comic books as a whole. So as of late, it seems to be a more prevalent thing where there's this almost tribalism of comic book fandoms. And I'm not going to lie, I have been part of that tribalism. I stand more on the DC Comics side than Marvel. It's more of a personal preference than it is a deep-seated animosity. However, personally, I've had more issues with Marvel fandoms than I would really almost any other culture of fandom. Even Star Wars fans are less toxic, it seems, than Marvel fans. And I'm not quite sure why that is, because when you get right down to the core of it, comic book movies as a whole are really just popcorn entertainment. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not necessarily meant to be high, intense, structured art. And that's not to discredit the actors or the filmmakers. This is more of just, calling it what it is. It's entertainment, and that's all it really should be. The problem is, when you have fandoms, any fandom, you have this almost mentality of ownership. And that goes for anything. Everyone feels more entitled as an audience than they would as the artist. It goes back to that age-old question. Who owns the art? The artist or the audience? It's kind of the same thing. Although the problem is it seems as though lately everything has been so intentionally trying to be less a fictional entertainment and more a platform for personal clout, I guess is the right word. And it's starting to slowly interfere with the overall point of comic books and the overall point of really entertainment as a whole, and that is just to entertain. Really, that's all it's meant to do. Just be fun, If you want to be intellectual, have at it. You want to be dramatic, you want to be dark, you want to be thought-provoking, you want to be fun, you want to be goofy, you want to tell jokes. That's what the medium is for. To really just, be your Play-Doh and do whatever you want with it. The problem is, when you start inserting your own personal narrative, it becomes less of a project and more of a thing that you are trying to force people to appreciate. And when you try to force people to appreciate anything, it's less sincere and genuine. Here's an example I have. So a lot of people have had issues with Brie Larson playing Captain Marvel. I myself have made no hesitancy over her specifically saying, just backhanded things that really just don't even make sense from a marketing perspective, not just from, a comic book fan perspective, where she'd say things trying to speak on the feminist agenda, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You want to be a representation to the youth. You want to be a representation to young women. You want to be a representation to whatever ideology you have. More power to you. The problem is when you start inserting the fictionalized representation you are as yourself. When the actor who plays Superman believes he is Superman, so to speak. When you forcefully blur that line, at least from a speaking perspective, you no longer can really be presented as a serious person. And the problem is the comic book industry has had a history of suffering through this sort of stuff before. Marvel in particular, in the past several years, have had multiple comic books rebooted over and over and over again. And the reason being, it has actually nothing to do with sales. It has everything to do with writing. If you write badly as a published, edited, finished thing, it has to go through multiple processes where everyone is okay with it. The problem is you have writers who are more focused on releasing their own political agenda or their own personal agenda than they do about just writing a basic comic book or creating a character. Don't use your character to push your personal agenda. Use your character to say what you can't, but not in a forceful way. I'll give you a quick example. Of doing it right and an example of doing it wrong. So, there was a character that was introduced several years ago, and it was kind of a refreshing version of Captain Marvel. Carol Danvers was still around, however, she had her own solo series where she would just be called Captain Marvel. They wanted to reintroduce a new version of Captain Marvel to a younger audience. And so they had a head writer giving her first-time major project, and she just so happened to be of Muslim faith. And she felt as though there are a lot of people within the Muslim faith that have never really had a hero or a person they could look up to that could deal with the struggles of being accepted into a society that doesn't quite understand them. So they reintroduced Miss Marvel as Kamala Khan, a Muslim American teenage girl who gets stricken by superpowers. So the concept of a person not only being treated differently because of ethnicity, religion, but dealing with the actual weird implications of her own superpowers, that's a concept I haven't seen in years, and it was pulled off fantastically. On top of that, she was also a proxy for comic book fans. She wrote fan fiction, she knew so much about different superheroes, she was especially big fans of the Avengers and the X-Men, things like that that kind of find a deeper connection to you, the audience. Then you have the idea done wrong, like they did with Riri Williams, aka Ironheart, the replacement to Tony Stark's Iron Man. A little bit of context here was Tony Stark was dead, essentially. They wanted to reinvigorate the concept of Iron Man to a new audience, and they thought, what could be more drastic than having a young black girl be the new Iron Man? Well, technically, it wouldn't be Iron Man, but Ironheart. And overall, the first few issues were okay. Then came the penultimate issue with her backstory, where it is revealed that the only reason for her entire existence, essentially, the only reason for her to want to be in Tony Stark's shadow or be similar to Tony Stark was, as a young girl in school, she yelled at her teacher and demanded her teacher tell her she can't do something because all of her heroes were told they couldn't do something. Her teacher, just offhandedly to stop her from being rowdy, tells her, I don't know, you can't be Iron Man. And she goes, watch me. Then uses that motivation to hack into MIT, steal the answers, get the valedictorian spot, and work for Tony Stark. If you don't see the problem in that entire origin story, really think about this. The hero of your story was motivated by ego and acted as a villain to become a hero. You see how stupid that sounds? Why not just make it that she worked closely with Tony, she was very well educated, she grew up in a really struggleless neighborhood, something along those lines. I'd have been fine with it. In fact, it was so bad, their sales dropped and plummeted rapidly after that issue. And they actually had to reboot the character and retcon the entire story. That is an example of pushing a narrative platform in the wrong direction. The Marvel movies have no exception. All of you have probably seen Endgame. That scene where they're in the battle and all of the women of the Marvel Universe are just standing there posing in the middle of a battle. It's so dumb because it doesn't make any sense for that specific moment. If they had done that at the beginning of the fight, sure. But the fact that they did that in the middle of the fight, just it couldn't have been more obvious that they're pushing a narrative. In fact, the series The Boys tackled it perfectly and making fun of it, doing the whole girls get it done, and when they ask what it is, They just say it, and that's it. It's basically that. You don't really have a narrative. You just want to push it to be a standout. It's kind of like the kid in school who'd yell and scream about his dad kicking everyone's ass, and you'd go, but this has nothing to do with what we're talking about. And the kid's more or less just blowing smoke up himself so that way he can make himself look bigger than he actually is. It's little things like that that just kind of get under my skin. Now, DC has a habit of doing the same thing with their films, but their narrative is not necessarily personally or politically motivated. It's more of trying to kind of doing what Marvel did for the comic industry, but for movies. In the 90s and pretty much most of their run, Marvel has had a habit of copying characters, and then DC will copy other characters. It's essentially the equivalent of having a grade school kid who copies your answers but can't quite see all the answers, so they kind of make up the answers. So DC executives will be more focused on release dates than they will be about overall product. That's where you get issues like the Suicide Squad movie, or the rough cut of Batman v Superman, or the original release of the Justice League. But when you have a narrative that is actually very well crafted and more focused on just letting an artist be an artist, you get things like Wonder Woman, or the Aquaman movie, or Captain America Winter Soldier, Doctor Strange, things like that can work really well where it's just a matter of, I want to make a good thing, and you do it, and then that's it. It shouldn't be a matter of, I want to push a sort of personal agenda or personal thing. And I'm not saying you can't do that. I'm not trying to be like a Fox News correspondent and say, you can't do that, it's destroying society. No. If you're in the industry and you have a voice, use it. My problem is, there's a difference between using your voice and shoehorning your voice where it doesn't belong. I personally love cake. I think cake is really good. However, I also love steak. If I got a steak handed to me and someone slapped a piece of cake over it, I'd be thoroughly pissed off. Not because I'm not going to eat them, but because you combine them for no reason. Instead of just allowing me to enjoy my cake and enjoy my steak, you forced both of them onto me to the point where they're not really going to work well together. And then you also have these issues where you have the tribalism. Ah, yes. The tribalism of fandoms. As a nerd, myself, I speak from experience of doing this. When you're a fan of something, you have this weird mentality of ownership, in the sense that you think part of what is out, you think that part of what you do, you own. Part of what you are a fan of, you have ownership over. And with that ownership, you start going, hey, I know these characters inside and out, and no one should tamper with them, or this isn't my vision of them. And in some ways that's true, but in other ways you also have to remember these characters are just as much theirs as yours. I know that's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow, but it is true. However, I think that when it destroys the basic fundamentals of what that character is, it no longer seems to have a reason. You're just pushing your own personal opinions, and you're using the character as a proxy for those opinions. It could literally be done with any character in fiction or non-fiction, period. Good example. I've been an outspoken advocate for mental health awareness. And if I wrote a character and created a character or used a character that had the same ideology of me, that's totally fine. But if it's an established character or person that you know wouldn't actually be like that, it just comes off as jarring. So if I said Dr. Doom was going around saying we need to worry about the children and mental health, you'd be looking like, wait, what? But Doom wouldn't say that. Doom doesn't care about kids. Or if I said, I don't know, what if I said Thanos went around going, we need to remember that children are our future, or we need to make anti-gun legislation. You'd be like, what? That's not Thanos. That's not how Thanos works. It's the same principle. You no longer are telling a story. You're telling your story. Which, if you want to do that, more power to you. But you also have to remember, with that, you also have to see it from the outside perspective. You can't just push your own opinions and feelings. You have to also be able to reverberate them off of the audience. If I'm writing a story, I write it as if it's the first time I'm hearing it. I listen as if I've never been told this story before. And that makes me appreciate the story even more than it would normally. It really does humble you to the perspective of others when you start thinking from their perspective. A lot of people can see a boss that they work with or supervisor and just see them as just a total ball breaker and just treat you like garbage, and you just can't stand the guy or girl anymore, and you're just like, I can't stand this person. They're just hateful and bitter and spiteful. But then you take a look from their perspective and see that they're being mistreated by people above them. They're constantly under pressure. Maybe they have a failing marriage. Maybe they have children or whatever that disrespect them. Maybe they're getting their pay cut. Maybe they're dealing with health issues. There's so many other perspectives, but you only base it off of face value. And when face value is all that you have, you're not really doing anything but being prejudiced to the person who you're judging. I have a habit of trying to base my judgment off of action. I don't see people based off of their word, because people have a habit of lying multiple times to my face. For better or for worse. That's just kind of my own personal perspective. Now, that's not to say I think everyone's a liar. I also don't think everyone's honest, because it's easy to lie, but it's really hard to tell the truth. It goes the same way with characters in the comic book industry. You always want to see them as more than. You want to see characters that you can not just relate to, but can be the betterment of yourself, or the ultimate fear of yourself, or a version of yourself that you currently aren't but strive to be. So many people look up to, Spider-Man or Superman or any of the Avengers, and they do that because it's not because they see them as real. It's because they see them as what they want to be. The fantasy of what could be. I mean, obviously, you can't really fly and shoot lasers. It's more of just revealing to oneself to understand what it could be. As I said, I'm a huge fan of comic books. I've read so many stories that have given me like emotional tethers, but I've read a lot of stories that have made me just irritated because they've been mishandled by people who do not understand the base outline of a character. There are certain basic fundamentals of each character that you know, and each writer should be able to understand those fundamentals in order to write for them. One of my favorite superheroes is Daredevil, because not only is he an advocate for people with disabilities to be better than themselves, but he also is an example of dealing with trauma and the concept of forgiveness. Yes, he was raised Catholic, but it's less to do with the Catholicism and more to do with the reasoning behind it. And that's a really aspiring way to approach it. You could just say, oh, he's Catholic, so, forgive and forget kind of thing. It's like, no, he doesn't forgive and forget. He takes that pain and bites down hard and just keeps going. And then you have the antithesis of that with the Punisher. A lot of people strive and like the Punisher, but don't really quite understand how he operates. The Punisher is ultimately not a hero. I know people say he's a vigilante, or he's an anti-hero, or no. He's a guy who dealt with trauma, a well-tactitioned military man dealing with trauma, who wants revenge on the world that wronged him. That's it. He cares nothing for really anyone, and he doesn't get close to anyone because he doesn't want to lose them. And then when he does get close to people, they usually die. So it's not even just that he kills people. If it was just that he killed people, I could deal with it. But he kills people indiscriminately. And his symbol has been so closely associated with those that claim to be heroes but are actually monsters in our world, that the narrative of how he's seen has shifted. In reality, a person like the Punisher existing in our world would not be a hero. He'd be terrifying. A guy who is perfectly brilliant enough to take out an entire army by himself, and yet would have no problem killing hundreds of thousands of people in order to stop one crime boss. That's terrifying. And it's not just Marvel, too. I know it seems like I'm constantly slamming Marvel. I'm not. DC has a habit of doing the exact same thing. One of the best, and probably one of the only real well-written series that deals with social political issues in a comic book forum is Green Lantern Green Arrow. It was the first comic to deal with things like drug abuse, civil rights movements, dealing with the issues of the day at the time. And even Green Arrow's sidekick, Speedy, I know, ironic, Speedy ended up being a drug addict. And it wasn't just a one-off, oh no, he did drugs one time and la-di-da, everything's fine. No, that became a prevalent part of Speedy's history. So long, even into the Teen Titans run, even into the Young Justice run, into so many different aspects of his character that it fundamentally changed him. He grew. And that's what they should do. Characters should grow, just like audiences should grow. When you watch an anime series or a book series, the character in chapter 43 is not going to be the same character as chapter 1. They evolve. They change. They adapt. And that's what you need to do. In everyday society, that's what we all have to do. You can't just preserve your basic fundamentals and just expect the world to work with it. You have to change with it. And doing that isn't necessarily bad. Trying to push your thing and try to say this is not the same way. There's so much things with like politics and religion and just overall opinions about everything. Everyone has an opinion about everything. And it gets to the point where you start thinking like, does it really matter? Like, I'm not saying not fighting. I'm saying if you need to fight, make sure it's a fight worth fighting for. When you see people yelling and screaming and saying, we need to prevent transgender people from being allowed to be people because what if they did something to our kids in the bathroom or something like that? And I'm just like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Like, just say what you mean. You don't like trans people. Just say that. If you don't like them, you're not obligated to like anybody. But when you start twisting these narratives, it kind of changes everyone's like, well, yeah, I don't like that either. If I worked at a candy factory and I told everyone, hey, this chocolate is going to get you cancer, and just enough people hear that, it's going to spread enough where people are going to start believing. If that narrative gets spread enough, people are going to start believing that the chocolate does give you cancer, and it's going to tamper the product because of some guy randomly spewing whatever the hell he wants. There's always two sides to it. But the problem is with comics, it's supposed to be escapism. And I have had more people on Marvel fan sites, on Marvel just fanboyism, that just every single thing that DC Comics does, everything, they could write really well-made characters. They could make things that will make you so happy and so intricate and so excited, and they'll still crap on it because it's not their brand. I don't care what your brand is. I don't. If you like chocolate chip mint ice cream, fantastic. It's just not my thing, but fantastic. You do you. But you don't get the right to smack out my strawberry cheesecake ice cream because I'm not having your ice cream. That's my big issue. It has absolutely nothing to do with Marvel DC or I like this and you like that. It's not even that. It comes down to that mindset of like, I like this and you like that. And I'm not okay with you liking what you do unless you like what I like. And that sort of rhetoric has been a part of human history for years that has literally caused people to hate each other and despise each other and fight and kill. Don't get me wrong. People should be held accountable for their opinions. But your opinions are just as valid as the next person. Off of a bit of a tangent, but one of the biggest issues I always had with, organized religion had nothing to do with the faith itself and had nothing to do with the practices itself. It has everything to do with this false narrative that because you worship the way you worship and because you have faith the way you have it, and because you practice a doctrine the way you practice, you're entitled to tell others that their doctrine is wrong. Why? Because your doctrine tells you it's okay to knock everyone else's beliefs? Because you feel that you're superior? Because you feel that anyone that's not your narrative is a spite upon your life? Does my being anything affect you, the listener? If I'm wearing clown shoes right now, if I was wearing a top hat, if I was wearing a monocle, if I was holding a rubber chicken, right now, would it affect you listening here? Obviously it wouldn't. But if you found out about that and that utterly offended you to the point where you clicked off and you were just like, I never want to hear this man again because how dare he taunt me with the rubber chicken. That's a stupid mindset to have. Of anything. I don't care what it is. It could be comics, it could be fandoms, it could be video games, it could really be anything. It doesn't matter. When you have the closed off mindset, you literally close off your mind. And that's the thing that gets to me about comic book fandoms and just fandoms in general is that tribalism. Like, I'm a big fan of wrestling. Everyone knows that. You listen to enough of my stuff, you know I'm a big fan of wrestling. But there's this whole tribalism of you either love AEW or you love WWE, and there's no in between, or you hate both of them, or whatever. No. There's always a case by case. I believe in one philosophy, and that's it. There's no such thing as an absolute. Ever. There's no such thing as absolutes. People that deal in absolutes are always flawed and will always fail. Every time. People that deal in absolutes do not understand how the world works. They feel that everything they do is just, everything's everything, this is this, that is that, and nothing changes. If you think nothing changes, newsflash, the world's going to change for you. You keep thinking that there's no such thing as global warming, nature's going to tell you, what'd you say? You keep thinking your drinking is going to have zero effect on your body. Your body's going to tell you, what did you just say? It's the same principle. Just because you put a house on a train tracks and close the curtains doesn't mean the train's not going to hit you. It truly boggles my mind just how much people seem to have this narrative of ownership over their fandoms. If you want to be a part of something, that's fantastic. I have multiple times met people, talked to people, been invited to things, done panels, done different things, worn a shirt, just a shirt of a thing that I enjoyed. And a random person off the street will look at it and go, hey, I like that too. We instantly have a connection from that point on. I may have just made that man's day. He may have just made my day. That connection will stay resonating with us for the rest of the day. It's the same principle. The connection is there. The tethers are there. But when you suddenly go, nuh-uh, you can't like this, nuh-uh, nuh-uh, you're no longer thinking freely. You're thinking like a child who has a magical mystery box that can never be opened except by them. And that's stupid. And that is the end of the Jack Rants Podcast. I hope you all enjoyed. Hope you're happy to hear me rant about whatever. And as always, I'll see you next time.